So for those of you, I think everyone here knows me. My name is Hugh Paterson, and you probably have all met my wife, Becky, who works on Tanya's project. This presentation came about because I started talking with Mark about a presentation I did at the 7th International Conference for Language Documentation and Conservation. In that talk, I talked a little bit about resource discovery as part of someone's online CV and their personal website. And so I talked about how a person can better advertise their research outputs. And in this talk, I build upon that, and I talk about it also from the perspective of the linguistic lab or the group or work group level. So that's kind of how this conversation and this talk came about. So that's kind of the background information here. So what are language resources? I use terminology that's interchangeable between research outputs and language resources, but language resources are services or corpora, grammar, publications and journal articles, software, audio of language documentation materials and video recordings for materials that are, these materials are exhibit a language or help explain a language. So these are often resources that linguistic researchers want to understand or use, or they often create them. And so that is part of what often gets put onto a CV, right? On a personal website, becomes part of our research outputs. So in the big ideas that I'm going to be talking about are the scholar, the lab, the research output, and the discovery and reuse of research outputs. Or another way to talk about that would be the impact of those discovery research outputs. So through my slides, I use these colors, these 4 colors to when I talk about those particular areas. So you'll see that throughout the slides. But because we're in a Zoom conference, let me say, everyone, can you do a little thing in the chat? Can you put 3 of your research outputs into the chat? Just the title or something that you've worked on, that you have either a language description or a journal article that talks about a language, or maybe you did some video work or a corpus that you put together. Just go ahead and put three of them into the chat.
So in which form? Just all the
yeah, just
all the
everyone,
details?
No, not all the details, just like a citation or just the name of it. The name of it. If you've worked on a project, a software project, or if you've worked on something that you would put on your CV that said, hey, I did something about some language I've studied, or to help some language researcher study something. Oh, yes, I see some of those things. Now I see them. Ooh, I like that one. Great. I see. Yeah, those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. So, and I see that some of those even have the language names in them. So yes, great. I'm gonna do that from time to time to create audience participation. So yes. And so when I talk about the lab, so one of the big ideas is the lab, right? And so by lab, I'm defining this as a bottom up kind of definition, and it's a sum of people that work together. I have a friend who put together the Rift Valley Network, which is a group of linguists and anthropologists. They work across disciplines from various institutions, and they work on languages in the Rift Valley area and descriptions there. And from my experience working with several different groups that work together on languages and language issues, is that people who work at labs or in work groups, they have real challenges, and they really want to know some things about when they try to work on a particular language. They want to know who else has written about it, and what have they said, and do I agree with them, and can I find those things that other people have said, and how do my research outputs then interact with those research outputs? Those are like some very common questions that researchers are trying to negotiate. And so I take this this perspective of a lab going bottom up versus a top down, because if you take a top-down perspective on information design and information dissemination, oftentimes you get a shorter perspective that looks at information at just how do you create a website or a presentation for the moment, the one that's going to either help you get the next round of funding, or the say what a lab or group is doing right now. And so I illustrate these two contrasts as a line segment versus array. Even in linguistics, right, we have completed actions or ongoing actions, right? We have these kinds of things in our grammar and our that we contrast with. But in a way, our research outputs are building trust by looking at the past and building trust for the future. So that's kind of the way I look at it. But at the lab level, we have a couple of interesting things. And I want to give this example from Australia. Some of you may have heard of Nick Teberger. He's involved with Paradisic, which is a language archive in Australia. And it's an interinstitutional archive. And I want to ask the question, labs create lots of research outputs. Where do they go and how are they findable? The eScholarship Center at the University of Melbourne, I think existed for at least 20 years. And they created, through their staff, 1,000 projects, mostly stored as Microsoft Access databases with HTML versions. But in 2020, like just last year, the entire research center was closed down. And so where are these research outputs going to go? And this is an issue that Nick and Peter are dealing with as they deal with the preservation of research outputs. But these research outputs, they represent knowledge, right? They represent time and investment of people and the careers of people, but they also represent the new understandings that they have, that those people developed through their work. So how do you continue to impact society with that? That research is a important issue that they are struggling with. So the findability of these research outputs and the continued impact for social engagement is a real issue all over the world. So I want to switch a little bit from labs and how they can be, how do we say this, short in time. Like they can be completed action versus ongoing action sometimes, to impact. You know, what do the people, I think sometimes when we do research, we want to say, what have I changed in my beliefs as I did my research? What were the findings and how did that shape me? And we do that, I think, scientifically by starting out and saying, what did people used to know or believe? And what do people believe now because of my work? And what do I know? And I think the the issue here is there's past social knowledge and belief, and there's current social knowledge belief, and then I change through the process as well. And so our CVs and our research outputs reflect this as we grow through our experiences. And as we grow, our young or early career, either way you put that, academics, they move from institution to institution, and they have a problem. I would classify myself as one of these. So I've worked at several different institutions, and I move through the pathway, and I want to take with me my knowledge, my understanding in that story, and I want to make that story widely available. But I think the institutions also have an opportunity to take advantage of these things, and they can facilitate the amplification of the research outputs of the people that pass through their doors. The career paths are beneficial to both people and the institutions. My own website, because of my career path, I took my own website into as a migrant researcher and took branding into my own hands and made a website where you can find my research outputs and my work. And several people at LLACAN have also done this, and this type of thing is beneficial to them. So this is something that I feel is well accepted at LLACAN. So I don't feel like it's too new of an idea, but and I've benefited from many of the personal websites as I've looked for resources on particular subjects that are of interest to me. So let's do another chat exercise. When you look for a language resource, where do you look? What are some tools that you use to find those language resources?
To find information about them, or to find them? I mean, to find them.
That's a good question. Both. I think both are very valid. How do you find that? What is the difference that you see in that?
Okay, I mean, I can find, for instance, information about certain sources, or let's say I want to find what has been published about a certain language, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have access to that source.
Right. Okay, like paywalls and issues like that.
Yes.
So I think maybe find about a resource is right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. No, I've benefited from Guillaume's huge PDF collection. But where did you get those sources, Guillaume? Where did do you have an exchange that you have with different? Great. It's a secret. Okay.
Yeah, this is being recorded, so it's better not to share that secret.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, those are great answers, and I use a lot of them as well. Let's see. So in my research, I've used Google and Google Scholar. I've used a website called WorldCat, which is an aggregate of world library catalogs. I've used VLO, which is the Virtual Language Observatory, part of the Clarin EU network. And there's, I think, close to several hundred different archives that have language materials in the EU and that are part of Clarin. And so the VLO helps you access the catalogs of those language archives, focusing mostly on like audio and video materials that would be the raw resources for language research, rather than like edited works or textual works. Languagearchives.org is a conglomerate of about 60 archives that advertise their materials together in a common repository. So the materials aren't there. This is the catalog, right? And then you would go to the language resources. So ELAR from SOAS and Pangloss from CNRS, and let's see, there's Paradisic. Those archives advertise their materials there. So you could go to languagearchives.org and look for language resources as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about languagearchives.org and google.com and scholar.google.com, because all three of them are different. Google Scholar has a unique search algorithm that informs it of results differently than google.com. So for google.com, Microsoft, Bing, Pinterest, and Yandex, they all use schema.org metadata in HTML files. And this is a particular, I'm not going to get into the details, but schema.org metadata, and then HTML5's metadata. Whereas Google Scholar uses something called Dublin Core or Highwire Press. So there's two different sets of metadata that inform the research, the discoverability of resources. Baidu.com is a Chinese search engine, and it contacts publishers directly to include published resources, but because they're a Chinese-based company, they obviously have a strong connection to Chinese-based publishers for the large academic resources of China. Microsoft Academy is going to be retired, sunset here in this year, later this year, but it was created through AI, artificial intelligence, looking at Bing's general search crawls. OLAC requires a provider to create a special feed, like a RSS feed, if everybody remembers the early days of the internet and RSS. And basically it absorbs those RSS feeds and then organizes it, the records of the materials. WorldCat connects with libraries and is usually driven by MARC 21 records. So, which is, I'm not going to talk much about those at all. And the ones I'm going to talk about are the Google Scholar and OLAC. So just to tell you a little bit that metadata works and how important it is, there's two examples here. One is from the Library of Congress, and at the Library of Congress, they have a program where they archive entire websites. So from Osborne works in that department that archives the entire web page from the whole site from a particular organization. And she did an experiment, and she looked at adding subject headings, which are metadata words, to the entire archived web site, and she found out that based on what people searched for, that if a web archive has subject headings, it's twice as likely to be visited at least once. It might not be what the person ends up wanting, but it becomes more relevant in their search results, and so that they're likely to visit at least once. And a more linguistic focused example, one of the librarians at the University of Kansas looked at the Kansas working papers in linguistics, and he added Library of Congress subject headings to the journal articles. And over the year following, noticed that there was a 66% increase for those articles that had enhanced metadata for the downloads of those articles. So people were finding them, they were downloading them, they were using them because they had taken the time to add metadata to the resources. So they were much more findable. I was talking earlier about the Open Language Archive community and OLAC. The way it works basically is illustrated in this slide here, where the archives take their catalog records, send it to OLAC, and OLAC creates a common interface for those records. And then it points you back to the archive for accessing the materials, right? And in my presentation in Hawaii, I talked about how a person could do the same thing as what the archives are doing and driving that from their CV. And OLAC, by way of analogy, is like, let's play a game. Let's play a game in a sports league. Let's play a specific, because it has different layers of technology. So OAI is Open Archives Initiative, and it's a communication protocol. And let's play soccer or football. And that's like OAI then employs Dublin Core as a metadata standard. But now how are you going to exercise that standard? Let's play soccer with a red ball. And that's what OLAC says. So different layers of granularity and specificity. OLAC is specifically designed for use with linguistic resources. And it has 4 basic taxonomies. But when we look at these taxonomies and we apply them to the language resources that we had before, such as journal articles, grammars, and books, and grammar sketches, then we only really need to use the blue ones. So the other ones are there and are very important if we're talking about language resources such as audio or video resources that are part of the raw resources of our work, the underlying data, if you will, rather than an analysis layer or a published work. But the blue ones here are subject headings that help people find, just like I talked about for the other ones, in the example previous of the lady at the Library of Congress and the librarian at University of Kansas. These subject headings help people find resources in linguistics. So there's a couple of subject headings here that I have organized, and the way I see it, when we talk about a language description, like a grammar or a paper or something that we've produced, the subject heading, like generally the broad scope here is phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and discourse. And you can do that with OLAC subject headings, so you can find the specific language and like the general area of research. So in that sense, it's very helpful for the broad discoverability of resources. And so one of the primitive assumptions of OLAC was that archives were the ones providing the metadata. However, my presentation in Hawaii this past year was the first implementation of an individual providing records to OLAC. Because the real world is that many times researchers don't make submissions to archives. So, whether it's HAL or another institutional repository. Some linguistic publishers like Brill or De Gruyter don't use OLAC either directly. They could. Maybe they just don't know about it yet. OLAC's been around since the year 2000, so we're going on 22 years. But it's still possibly young, and then people might be busy. Sometimes archives forget to update their feeds, and that's a great reason why we should consider using our CVs and making our CVs tell OLAC that it has that we know where extra resources are about a language or language resource. In general, curators at institutional repositories who focus on archiving all sorts of materials, whether it's from the STEM sciences or the humanities, don't usually take the extra steps needed to catalog or make the metadata pertinent of the language specific resources that we create. So they're focused on a general audience, and as linguists, we're very specific in what our needs and what our interests are. So in general repository software, the software that organizations like Zenodo or archive.org or HAL or and the software types like DSpace don't usually cater to linguistic resources and the taxonomies that we use. So sometimes there's no interest on the part of the organization management, and sometimes there's no capability inside the software. So sometimes, and both of those issues can lead me to suggest that a great solution is to make our CVs communicate directly with OLAC. And so that's my solution in Hawaii. This is my great statement, was that we need to structure linguist personal branding efforts to include participation in OLAC. And the result is, hey, notice me. Like you get more notice when people are looking around at languages. And what I've noticed is that scholars often use Wix or ResearchGate or academia.edu or have a WordPress site. And those are all good solutions, but they don't solve the I'm looking for resources about language XYZ question. They don't help people find that particular resource. And not always does the language name appear in the resource name. So I recently was working on a annotated bibliography for a language of Nepal, and I was looking through academia.edu, and it was consistently making my search results less and less because they wanted me to buy a subscription. So you deal with those sorts of issues as well. In my solution, I used open source technologies called Hugo, and I used GitHub, but many people use a service called Netlify. And I used a theme for software that runs on top of Hugo called WildChemy, which is designed for academics. And currently somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 academics use WildChemy for their personal online presence CV distribution of their academic outputs. And so my test case was my wife. I did her professional presentation with looking very similar to mine. So I learned on mine, and then I implemented on hers, and then I did the OLAC implementation with hers. So I also added Google Scholar metadata information, which is different than regular Google metadata information. So all of her works now appear in Google Scholar straight from her website. And so whenever her website gets updated, Google Scholar knows, and Google Scholar even knows that how they are interconnected with each other. So Becky and I have a co-authored presentation next week on reported speech in Western Cebuanan, which is a Philippine language. And it knows that that resource cites her previous work at in this past March. So again, my workflow was to use the Markdown documents. So Markdown is a text language that's kind of like Wiki, if you've ever edited Wikipedia. And then I used a custom RSS template in Hugo, deployed to Hugo, validated my RSS-like feed to OLAC, and then it's included in OLAC, and that's what my code is. So I'm doing several things. I'm increasing the visibility in standard Google, I'm increasing the visibility in Google Scholar, and I'm increasing the visibility in OLAC from Becky's website. But now let's talk about the lab a little bit. That's like I'm talking about how an individual person can do that. And one of the things that we could think about is how could a lab do this to support the individuals in the lab? And one of the things I've benefited from LLACAN is one of the first people I met was Vidrine, and he's a prolific writer. You can see the red square in the top right. It's just this is what's visible here. I mean, his list of publications is large, and I was looking at Eastern Dan and publications that were related to Eastern Dan. So that's his specialty. And so LLACAN does do professional profiles, including research outputs. And one possibility would be to increase the social profile of the lab, would be to increase the metadata related to personal profiles, so that Google Scholar and Google General Search and OLAC understand those personal profiles. But I think there's also other things that a lab has. Labs facilitate projects, right? So it could be an entire corpus that becomes a language resource that OLAC would understand that there's 25 languages discussed in this corpus or something like that, right? So that's one type of output. But LLACAN also does publication venues. So much like the working papers in linguistics from Kansas University, MundaCon is, I think, just one of the publication venues that LLACAN sponsors. Does somebody want to put in the chat how many different publication venues LLACAN sponsors, or what their names are? LLA, MundaCon, CLO. It's at least 3. Okay. So yeah, helping people find those publications would increase the profile of the lab as well. And then I had to stretch back and think a little bit about services, because one of the things that nobody in, what I should say is, it's new research, it's new opportunity, is to talk about services, because no one in the OLAC community or the archive community has really talked about services. A service is where somebody can go somewhere and do something with something and come back with a different product. So one service is Google Translate, right? You go to Google Translate, you put in your text and you get a new text back. And that helps me in France when I don't speak much French. But I use similar services for when I was learning German in my undergrad. And one service that I know that LLACAN offers is Reflex, and a linguist can go there. They can look at data, they can make assumptions, test those assertions or those hypotheses, and pull data out and use that data in a publication, right? So it's more than just a collection of data. It allows the researcher to engage. And so this is really interesting, because I don't know of many other labs or work groups that allow services, or that have services to offer. And so advertising the service is not just advertising the content, but it's also advertising the service to OLAC. And I think that would be a great thing to be able to do, to let the world know that LLACAN has some great things to offer. And so as I'm kind of getting towards the end of my slides, and willing to take questions and things like that, some action steps that I think that are both practical and implementable for how a lab approaches the internet. I've put in 5 things here. The first is to use HTTPS instead of HTTP on all websites. And HTTPS is a security protocol. But more importantly, I think, than just the security of it, is that Google search algorithm has about 125, 150 different things that they assess and rank, but they rank you down lower if you're not using HTTPS. So fewer people are going to find your resources if you use HTTP rather than HTTPS. And the other one is that the way Google, and I believe Bing does this as well, is that they put materials that are on a geographically related website domain name, and they rank them higher for searches within that geographic region, but rank them lower for searches outside of that region. So a .fr website is going to rank higher within France, but lower outside of France. So one strategy that could be used is to also advertise materials on a .org or a .com website And this is something to think about. My own website is on a .us, and I'm playing with that because it's Becky and me on the same website, and it's .us. So I'm using a little bit of play on words there, but I do have the problem where it's going to rank me higher in the US and lower outside the US. And so a way to get around that is to use a service like OLAC to advertise linguistic resources, because it's on a .org domain name. Then to use schema.org metadata for general Google results, and Dublin Core or Highwire tags for Google Scholar results, and to create feeds for linguistic resources and language use. So I want to close out with thank you and one last question. And I would like you to think about and maybe answer in the chat, which resources from your work do you wish were more visible?
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to take general questions too.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
It's not really a question, actually, it's an observation I made. I tried to use OLAC for searches on languages, and I was struck by the fact that everything in OLAC has the same level of visibility, and many of the results in OLAC are in fact only about metadata and not about data. So you can click on, you never know exactly what you find, and after a while searching in OLAC, you get discouraged because there are no data actually available via OLAC. So it's really a problem because everything has the same kind of level of interest. Even this, the pages in Ethnologue are ranked the same as collections of data in other websites. So if you know about the language, you don't really want to have just a reference to the Ethnologue webpage because you already know that. Same for Glottolog. And so it's in the sense it's nice because it lists everything that possibly exists, but in another way it's really useless because you get overwhelmed by metadata things and no data actually. So.
Right. I think if I were to recapitalize or restate the observation is that there's no ranking of relevancy for resources within a page on OLAC to help you understand which ones kind of clump together to make a concerted resource or a collective resource versus something else. And I would agree that that's a downfall of the design of the web page, and it could change given funding or attention to that could change.
Who is actually curating OLAC?
Well, the data that makes up the content of the pages is provided by anyone who provides a feed, right? But the architecture of the website was built in 2003, right? So it's really represents the web from a long time ago. And it's Stephen Bird and Gary Simons, and they had a, in the United States, the federal funding program is the National Science Foundation. They had an NSF grant, and the website was built with that funds. And I don't think they've had a grant since then, but I don't know that I know that the funding agency has a new, how do you say this? A new program to fund digital infrastructure for linguistics. And so, I mean, there's a possibility that someone could form a collaboration and say, hey, we would like to bring some new ideas to how you browse information about resources, because OLAC, remember, OLAC doesn't have the actual resources. It's only a catalog.
I know, but you know, that's the main problem behind all this is probably that everybody wants his work to be known, but nobody wants to give away his data. So that's something which is unbalanced.
Well, you know, Pangloss does a really good job.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Pangloss is great for that, and I think Reflex is great for that too, because the data are really there, but otherwise it's really difficult to find some actual data on languages.
Yeah, no, I've been really impressed because Pangloss sends their metadata, the fact that something exists, to OLAC. And so when I'm browsing OLAC, I can see, oh, this exists in Australia, and I know that is a open access, generally open access archive. I know that Pangloss is generally an open access archive. And so I can find some good resources for materials that I'm looking for when I use OLAC.
Are there other questions? Yeah, maybe I can raise the issue of LLA. So I'm the editor-in-chief of LLA, and I think we have a huge problem of visibility. So our journal is open access, so I think we follow fairly strict quality standards, but we really have a problem to be seen, I think, because we get fairly few contributions, and I think people are not really aware that we exist, although we have been editing this journal for 6 years now. Yeah. And so very practically, I mean, you have suggested some actions. So which ones do you think are most relevant to LLA?
I think that the Google Scholar one is most relevant. So the Dublin core and Highwire tags. I mean, I haven't checked to see if is on, how do I say it, if it's showing up in Google Scholar at the moment, because so scholar.google.com is the Google Scholar search, and I use that extensively in my research to find resources and realize that there's two separate search engines, right? And one's Google and one's Google Scholar, and they look for different kinds of metadata, so they're going to give you different results. And Google Scholar results might show up in Google's general search, but that's only because they pull from several different types of search engines on their Google site, so to generate relevance. So it might not rank as high on general Scholar on general Google as it would on Google Scholar. But using the Dublin core and Highwire tags, what is the software platform that you're using? Because I know that some things I find from LLACAN are in open editions, and some it's an open editions journal or no?
No, not yet. I mean, we have asked to be included in open edition, but we are not yet admitted. I mean, there's a process to go through, so we are expecting to be told this month whether we are finally admitted to open edition, which would of course resolve certain problems, because then open edition takes care of, I mean, of forwarding metadata to relevant websites.
Right.
At the moment, it's published by a tiny publisher, and we put all the PDFs and so on our own LLACAN website.
Yeah. So I would, if you're not going to go with open editions, I haven't checked to see if open editions are doing Google Scholar tags or not. I've looked at open editions for several different reasons, but and several of the articles that I have referenced in my work have been hosted on open editions. So it has some very interesting qualities about it in terms of the technology that they use, and so in a good way. So if you are going to make that move, I would say probably don't worry about it until after you move. But after that, there would be, I think, a very interesting discussion to have with Open Editions to ask if they would support an OLAC feed from the metadata. So you might be able, so Dublin Core on the Google Scholar is about 75% of what's required for OLAC. So if you're already generating metadata as a publisher for good Google Scholar results, then doing a couple of little pieces for so that it becomes more relevant for linguists is very easy. And I know that Open Editions as a corporation or a company or a publisher has a lot of linguistic journals. They have at least 12 linguistic journals from different labs and departments and things like this. So it would be a unit of work that would be replicable along different journals. So it'd be an interesting conversation to have, I think.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's also the question is maybe there are two different things. One is are the individual contributions visible?
Right.
But of course, is the journal known as being a journal that follows certain quality criteria and is open access? And so is it known as a relevant Africanist journal? So that's maybe still another question.
And I think there was did you put out a call just a couple of weeks ago? Yes. So I saw that call and I got to thinking, oh, I could put something in there. But I think that was when I first heard about it.
Yes.
So
that was also one of the aims of distributing that call, not only, I mean, it's also to say, hey, we are here, and we also do other stuff, not only publish special issues. It had these two purposes.
No, I'm a guest editor on another project for a data journal, so I've come to appreciate the visibility of journals in a kind of a new way through this process. And I think in general, though, I've been planning a experiment to see at how visible are periodical issues, like not just the articles, like let's say a journal article, how visible are journal articles or how well described are they in OLAC? And I've found only 3 different organizations that provide information about journal articles in OLAC. So this is some upcoming research that I'm doing, and I would like to see more publishers put their content there just directly and make it more findable for people who are looking by language. Because it's hard to, libraries don't often catalog journals. They're just, they'll do the whole thing. They say, oh, you can go to the database and find the particular issues, but they don't catalog particular articles. So
all right. Okay, I keep that in mind. So once the Open Edition has taken a decision, then I'll follow up. I'll ask them where did they actually send their metadata.
And you can always contact me again, and we can have some more detailed conversation about it.
Are there any other questions? Oh, silence. So it was clear, it means.
Et moi, j'avais une question. J'étais en train de regarder OLAC et je vois par exemple que sur OLAC, moi, ce que j'ai mis sur le CRDO, c'est dans OLAC. C'est référencié. Donc, ce qui est sur Cocoon est référencié dans OLAC.
Où tu l'as mis sur CR?
Oui, dans OLAC, je veux dire tout ce qui est référencié dans le CRDO, ce qui était le centre de recherche et de documentation.
Paulette,
Oui.
ça ne s'appelle plus CRDO, c'est Cocoon.
Voilà, Cocoon, et bien Cocoon, il est référencié dans OLAC, c'est ça que je voulais dire. Donc
Oui.
moi, ce que j'ai dans Cocoon, il est référencié sur OLAC.
Tout à fait, parce que Cocoon expose ses archives et OLAC va les chercher régulièrement.
Oui. Non, mais je voulais le signaler, puisque, voilà.
Okay, Hugh, so Paulette checked out what is found about her work on OLAC, and she was happy to see that her deposits at Cocoon are listed in OLAC.
Yes, Cocoon does a very good job of describing materials, and I've told Becky that we should take our materials from Africa and put them in Cocoon or at Pangloss, because I really appreciate the attention to library organization that I see at Cocoon and Pangloss.
Yeah.
Yeah. I may have a suggestion for the articles in the journal in LLA. The library downstairs at Villejuif does that. So maybe you could have a discussion with them, because usually they reference all the articles in journals.
Okay.
But I don't know whether the what is it? The software they use is referenced in OLAC or something, but maybe this is a discussion that could be done with them.
That would be very interesting, and I'd be happy to make the acquaintance of the librarians there.
Yes.
I need somebody to introduce me.
Well,
yeah,
we could do that when we can go back normally to work.
So yes, I'm very happy to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah, I'll check out who is doing what, and I'll let you know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So, any other questions, maybe from the tech people? All right. If not, yeah. If not, thank you very much for your ideas. I think we have to reread things. So it was actually it was good that it was recorded so that we can even re-watch it to digest some of the suggestions and yeah, maybe get back to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd be very